Hello and welcome to another episode of The Voice for American Law Enforcement with your host, Randy Sutton, 34-year police veteran, the founder of the Wounded Blue, which is the National Assistance and Support Organization for Injured and Disabled Officers, author of A Cop's Life and the soon-to-be-released new book, Rescuing 911, The Fight for America's Safety. And I want to thank you for joining me here today. I have a great co-host waiting for me in the interview room. Let's bring him on right now. Craig Floyd. Let me tell you a little bit about Craig Floyd. He is the founder of an amazing organization called Citizens Behind the Badge. It's a 501c3 charity that supports law enforcement. But this isn't his first rodeo. He spent decades working as the chairman of one of the most important law enforcement charities in the country, the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, and I welcome him to the show. Craig, thanks so much for joining me today on The Voice for American Law Enforcement.
Love to be with you once again, Randy. We've spent a lot of time together over the years. You've been a great friend and supporter, and I'm proud to be on the show today.
Oh, I appreciate it, man. And yes, you're right. There's a lot of water under that bridge, brother. But so
I don't know if you probably have not told your viewers that you have another occupation that sometimes you involve yourself, and that's a wonderful singing career. And you were one of my favorite memories is having Randy Sutton do the national anthem at one of our candlelight vigils at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. You banged it out beautifully, and once again, you got many talents, and that's a hidden one. I don't think that people know about.
I think you're probably right. And you know what? I got to tell you, in my law enforcement career, that was one of my proudest moments, Craig, quite honestly. I'll never forget the feeling of being up on that stage looking at the families of the officers who were killed in the line of duty at that what I call hallowed event. And it truly was one of the greatest honors I've ever been given. And it was really an amazing moment. Thanks for reminding me. I actually think about it quite often, quite honestly. So let's talk about your new organization, what it is doing. But you know what? If you would, though, I want the audience to get to know you just a little bit. If you would, just give a little bit about your background.
You know, right out of college, I went to George Washington University here in Washington, D.C., and I had the privilege, really, of being hooked up with an amazing gentleman. His name was Mario Biaggi. He was a legendary New York City police officer, the most decorated cop in New York City history when he retired in 1965. And then he went on to serve 20 years in the United States Congress. I was privileged to join him for 10 of those years, the last 10, as his legislative assistant. And that really got me on the path that I spent the rest of my professional career working on, and that is a champion of law enforcement. Congressman Biaggi basically championed so many pieces of legislation and policies involving law enforcement. If there was a concern law enforcement had legislatively, they would come to our office and ask for help. And one of those requests was to build a National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. And I remember the day a group of officers came into our office. It had been dormant, the idea, for several years, but they asked him to reintroduce that legislation. And in 1984, it became public law. We established a National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. It took us 7 years after the law was enacted to actually dedicate the memorial. We had to raise over $11 million to build it. We had to pick a site that was appropriate for such a national monument, a place called Judiciary Square, federal land that was donated to us by Congress. And it's become the special place, the sacred ground for law enforcement in America. It's a 3-acre park. It has the names of now more than 22,000 officers who have made the ultimate sacrifice. And sadly, Randy, you know this, it was less than half filled when we first built it. And we thought it would be at least 100 years before we ever had to worry about expanding the memorial walls. And we hoped that day would never come. But in fact, because we've had to add so many names over the last 30 years, the effort was completed last year to expand the memorial walls, make more room for more names. And tragically, this year there were several hundred that had to be added to the National Memorial.
Yeah, it's. I was actually there for Police Week this year, once again, and in my capacity as the founder of the Wounded Blue this time, not as a serving law enforcement officer, but it's still that ground is sacred to law enforcement officers all over the country. If you haven't visited this site, I urge you to. It'll give you some amazing perspective and an emotional journey as you see the names and this beautiful memorial. So it cost $11 million back in the 80s. What do you think it would cost now?
Well, I dare say it would probably be double in cost, if not more. And I'll tell you something else, and this segues nicely into the next stage of our evolution at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. Not only did we become the leading agency involved in promoting law enforcement safety and wellness, but we, in 2018, the year that I retired, we built the National Law Enforcement Museum. It took us 20 years to get that museum built. And that museum, right across the street from the National Memorial, cost over $105 billion to build. It's a beautiful 60,000 square foot space, but that kind of gives you a sense of how much more expensive things are these days. We have a beautiful complex now. You've got a memorial to law enforcement on one side of the 400 block of E Street, Northwest Washington, D.C., and on the other side of E Street, you have the National Law Enforcement Museum, which, among other things, it tells the full story of American law enforcement, but just as importantly, it tells the stories behind the 22,000 plus names that are on that memorial. So that was very important to me, that too many people come to that memorial. And a lot of school kids, for example, they might be from Cincinnati, and they'd be interested in looking up the Cincinnati officers who died in the line of duty, and we have directories that allow them to do that. But they don't know the stories behind those men and women. And now at the National Law Enforcement Museum, they can walk right across the street and go into the Hall of Remembrance, where they'll hear the stories behind these law enforcement heroes who have sacrificed their lives for their community, for their nation. And we owe all of those men and women a huge debt of gratitude, and they should never be forgotten. And now that their names are inscribed on the memorial walls, now that their story is told in the National Law Enforcement Museum, they will never be forgotten for generations to come.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. I mean, you've dedicated your entire life to supporting law enforcement in a variety of ways, and the impact has been amazing. So now that you have, as we talked about a little bit earlier, now that you've failed retirement, you've now entered a new chapter in the creation of Citizens Behind the Badge. Let's talk about that for a bit.
Well, at the end of 2018, we had completed this 20-year journey to build the National Law Enforcement Museum, and that had always been my goal, is to see that museum through till the very end before I ever thought about retirement. And when that time came, I had a few months to enjoy the museum, to get the foundation laid, if you will, for our visitors that were about to come. And I stepped away and felt pretty good that we had accomplished the missions that I had set out on some 34 years prior. But then May 25th, 2020 happened. And some people may not totally remember the date, but that is the date that George Floyd died in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And it was a tragedy in so many respects. But certainly it started a anti-cop protest in this country, the likes that we have never seen before, and hopefully we'll never see again. The hatred toward law enforcement. There were more than 10,000 protests across this country against police. All of a sudden, as one officer recently said, suddenly we were hated overnight. All of a sudden they went from being our guardians, our protectors, the people that we respected and appreciated, to this villain that was hated by so many people across this country. And I must say, the media was very complicit in this. I think it was a minority of people in this country who actually spewed that hatred toward law enforcement. And they did it in a very destructive, violent way in many cities across this country. But the fact of the matter is that the majority of Americans support law enforcement. But the media portrayal, the way they amplified the voice of a few against law enforcement, was very upsetting to me. And I was having a great time in retirement, playing a lot of golf, enjoying my family. But when May 25th, 2020 happened, I said, you know what? I can't sit on the sidelines any longer and allow these lies about law enforcement being brutal racists, targeting blacks, targeting minorities across this country. I knew that the facts did not support that narrative, and yet I continued to see it on the news day in and day out. And so I decided to do something about it. I started a 501c4 nonprofit advocacy organization in support of the men and women in law enforcement. And I called it, I think very appropriately, Citizens Behind the Badge. There are millions of citizens like myself who have never worn the badge, but have great respect and appreciation for our law enforcement professionals. And so I wanted to mobilize the silent majority who support law enforcement to stop this very destructive, this very dangerous defund the police movement and all the soft on crime policies that have resulted, and get legislators in place, get elected officials in office that were going to be pro law and order, pro law enforcement. And that's one of our main agenda items. Another long-term goal, we're just getting started, really. We've only been in existence for less than 2 years, but I want to raise money so that school kids across this country can come to Washington and visit the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and Museum. I think from that, it's going to be an amazing recruiting tool for young people. They're going to see what law enforcement is all about, truly, the facts, the heroism, the way they help and protect their communities. They don't hurt anybody intentionally. Sometimes it's a part of the job, unfortunately. But the bottom line is we need to do so much more to improve recruitment, to build up police morale. We've sent thousands of declarations of support to local police departments across the country from citizens in their communities who support them and have sent back this declaration of support to our organization. So there's so many things we're doing right now, but mainly we're trying to counter all the negativity toward law enforcement with the truth, with the facts. And if you go to our website at behindbadge.org, you'll find all of these facts and heroic stories, and we honor the fallen officers. It's really been an amazing journey, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Well, you're like the Energizer Bunny, man. You just keep on going. It's how does
somebody have to at these troubling times, Randy? As you know, I mean, you worn the badge. I mean, you've been out there. I haven't, but I've met thousands of people like yourself. I know what's in your heart. I know what you do when the cameras aren't on, when nobody's watching. There's a great story that I've often told. I used to host a radio show called CopNet, and at the end of every show, I would interview a survivor and ask them about their story of their loved one. And I asked this one woman, I said, your husband died in the line of duty. Can you tell me something about the funeral for your husband? And she told me an amazing story. She said, I don't remember much. It was a fog that day. But this one moment stuck out in my mind. She said, a homeless man walked up to me and introduced himself. He said, you don't know me, but I'm here to pay my respects to your husband. Because he said every night before he would go home to you and your children, he would stop and check on me to make sure I was okay, to make sure I had a blanket in the winter, and make sure I had some food in my stomach. And he would take care of me, and he watched over me. And the woman said, what was amazing, Craig, is my husband never once told me about that homeless man. He just did it because it was who he was. He didn't bring it home with him. He didn't brag about it. But this is what our men and women in law enforcement do day in and day out. And I want the rest of the nation to hear these stories and to know how much we truly should be appreciative of the men and women who wear the blue.
The acts of kindness and compassion that are evidenced daily in policing in America, it's literally uncountable. Of course, in my 34 years, I saw amazing acts of kindness, small acts of kindness, but it's those little interactions like you just talked about that can create the difference in a person's life and also in the way that they view law enforcement. And unfortunately, when there are negative incidents concerning law enforcement, those become incredibly amplified. And you said it very accurately. The media has been exceedingly complicit with pushing forth the narrative of institutional racist police officers and brutality, and it is literally, created a divide in this country that is felt in ways that you and I could never have even imagined. And you and I both, went through the era of the Rodney King riots, which they were dwarfed by what we saw in relation to George Floyd. So it seems like we haven't learned any lessons along the way. And the only way to change the perspective is to tell the truth about the men and women of law enforcement. And how to get that truth out there is the Memorial Fund, the museum, an organization like Citizens Behind the Badge, where you're being a truth sayer. But sometimes it's we don't both your charity, my charity, the Wounded Blue, we're swimming upstream. It seems like when it comes down to getting our information out there, even to the point where letting people know we exist. So this is a fight that we are constantly in. And sometimes it seems like a pretty lonely path. So if someone wants to participate in Citizens Behind the Badge, what does that look like?
Well, first of all, I'd encourage them to visit our website, again, behindbadge.org. And you'll go there and you'll see it packed full of information in support of law enforcement. I have one section there that I update every day, unfortunately. It's called Troubling Consequences of the Defund the Police Movement. And it talks about the surge in crime rates across this country. I also have a section called, Crime and Policing Stats. And there I try to really tell the truth. What do the facts tell us about law enforcement? Are they brutal racists? No, you go there and you'll find that of the 60 plus million contacts, interactions law enforcement has every year with the public, they use or even threaten the use of force less than 2% of the time. All right, it hardly ever occurs. 73% of the officers recently surveyed say they've never fired their weapon in the line of duty, and they never will. And the Washington Post keeps track of police shootings, right? People they've shot and killed. And it turns out that twice the number of white people are killed every year by police than blacks. And yet you don't hear a word about that. All you hear about is the unarmed blacks that are shot and killed by police. And that number, for instance, I think it was in 2019, 26 whites were shot and killed who were unarmed by police. And 16 blacks were shot and killed by police. You've heard all the names of those who are the unarmed blacks, but you hear nothing about the fact that it's part of the job that unfortunately there are these life and death moments. They have a fraction of a second to make a life or death decision. And unfortunately, sometimes they have shot and killed unarmed people, but they're not targeting blacks. It's just the nature of the job. It's a very dangerous job. More than 22,000 officers have been killed. Last year, there was a 115% increase in the number of ambush shooting attacks on law enforcement officers in this country. More than 300 officers were shot last year, many of them in these ambush-style attacks simply because of the uniform they wear and the job that they do. And these are the facts that we want to get out there to the public because they're not hearing any of that from the media.
No, you're absolutely right. And this is part of truth saying. But as I said before, it seems like the negativity is what gets all the attention. The positivity does not. And so we are swimming uphill, and it is a long battle. So how does a citizen who and I am in 100% agreement with you that the vast majority of Americans believe in and support their law enforcement. And of course, there have been studies that have shown that from the University of Washington, I believe Harvard had a study. So every study has actually shown that the vast majority of Americans, including communities of color, actually do support and believe in their law enforcement community. But yet, you won't see that on the media. That's literally buried. So the people that do support and Citizens Behind the Badge is representative of that. How would a citizen, what does it look like as far as, I'm John Q. Citizen, I want to support law enforcement, and I know I can go to the Wounded Blue and help those folks, but I can also show my support through Citizens Behind the Badge. How does that happen?
Well, if you go to our website again at behindbadge.org, there is a section on there for donations. Like all nonprofits, like Wounded Blue and all the others, we basically do our work solely on the basis of donations we receive from the American public. So if you'd like to make a donation to support the work, if you like what you see on that website, if you're concerned about the defund the police movement and the soft on crime policies that have resulted, we'd love for you to make a donation, whatever you might be able to afford. And we also have this program, and it's a very important project, I would say, to send declarations of support to law enforcement agencies across this country, to build them up, to let them know that there are millions of Americans. Our goal is to have 10 million declarations of support sent to law enforcement agencies across this country. So our law enforcement professionals will know how much the public truly cares and supports the work that they do. So those would be important action steps. We also have surveys we're doing, 1 million surveys of Americans across this country about what they truly feel and believe about their local police, about crime in general, about some of these soft on crime district attorneys. Is that happening in your community? We're asking them these questions so that we can target elected officials. We want to mobilize the electorate so that they elect pro-law and order candidates. And we're trying to identify who are the good guys and who are the anti-cop, anti-law and order politicians that we need to unseat because crime is just surging like never seen before. All of these are action steps that Citizens Behind the Badge is taking. And if you go to our website, you can ask to be kept in communication with us. We'll send you notifications. If you scroll down on the homepage, you send us your name and email address, and we can stay in touch with you. We can send you action steps to be taken. We can help you figure out how to go to your local politicians and make sure that they're the right people and the job for you. And all of this is part of Citizens Behind the Badge, our agenda. And we would love your support, but we would also love to stay in touch with you and continue to take action in the years to come.
This is critical stuff. By being informed, you can help create an entirely different environment. And being informed is absolutely essential. I think some of the apathy we have seen in elections across the country has put people into office who have literally led the anti-law enforcement parade, and I don't think it's because the voters really wanted that, but you have such a low voter turnout in many of these elections, and they are uninformed about the people who are getting into office. I mean, this is a perfect segue to talk about the district attorneys that are literally I call them Trojan horse district attorneys who have been put into office, literally given the keys to the kingdom, and then actively worked to subvert the criminal justice system. And this has been extremely damaging to law enforcement and also to the public safety. But before we get into that, Craig, I got to take a little commercial break here and talk about officerprivacy.com. Officerprivacy.com is a business, but it is a service that helps law enforcement officers from being doxxed. We all know that the liberal left, Antifa, and other groups have basically made it their mission to try and harm law enforcement officers, both literally and figuratively. How do they do it? Sometimes I had no idea. Pete James, who began this organization, OfficerPrivacy.com, demonstrated to me, showed me how easy it was to find your information on the internet. I mean, personal information, where you live, much about your history, what kind of cars you drive. It's amazing. And so I really urge, if you're active duty or retired law enforcement, go to OfficerPrivacy.com. Check this out. It's not an expensive proposition. And they monitor and help remove the information that's on there that can literally lead to you being identified and could lead to harm to you or your family. So check out OfficerPrivacy.com. It's an amazing company, and they're doing great work. So check that out, OfficerPrivacy.com. Craig, let's get into. Do you want to talk any more about your organization, or should we segue into the news portion of this program?
Well, I think what we've talked about lays a great foundation for the news of the day. And I know you're going to touch on some of the soft on crime policies, the DAs that have refused to prosecute criminals that commit violent acts. In New York City, of course, we have a DA there, newly elected, that basically told his prosecutors, don't even consider life without parole for murderers. That's off the table. That's too severe a punishment for a cold-blooded murder. So these are the kind of people we're dealing with, and Citizens Behind the Badge is all about trying to make sure that those kind of people never get elected ever again.
Yeah, that's really critically important. I'm happy that you created this organization, Craig, and I know that we're going to work together in a lot of different ways to assist each other's organizations. Tell the truth about law enforcement, which is really, that's our goal. But let's talk about these district attorneys. So we're actually filming this show on the same day that there is the recall election effort in San Francisco. As we speak, the voters of San Francisco are deciding if they're going to recall Chesa Boudin, who is their exceedingly radical district attorney. A little bit of history about Chesa Boudin, if you don't know, is his parents were both convicted terrorists, cop killers, who served decades behind bars for the brutal murders that they committed as literally domestic terrorists. And Chesa Boudin grew up with the mentors of terrorism and socialism as his that was what he cut his teeth on. And somehow, Craig, it is mind-boggling to me that allegedly intelligent voters in San Francisco would put this guy into office in the first place, and he didn't make any bones about it. He said what he was going to do, that he was going to basically not prosecute anybody for anything. But I guess maybe what has happened is the real-world implications of a radical district attorney have now revealed themselves in a myriad of ways in San Francisco. And now that has led to probably one of the most robust recall efforts I've ever seen. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, and I am appalled that San Francisco voters would have elected him in the first place. But I think, again, this was part of the George Floyd anti-cop, we hate all cops are bad, and there's too many people in our prisons and jails, so let's go the entire other way of the spectrum and let prisoners out of jails. Let's not prosecute criminals who are committing violent acts. And this person, as you say, Chesa, was raised by self-styled revolutionaries. They claimed to hate the United States government. They were out to be revolutionaries. In 1981, they committed the famous Brinks robbery, where a security guard for Brinks and two law enforcement professionals were gunned down in cold blood. And he was raised by these people. He was 1 year old when that Brinks robbery occurred. And he was raised by other members of the Weather Underground who were also self-styled revolutionaries, because his natural parents were now going to be in prison for many, many years to come. So they handed him off to these other self-styled revolutionaries. It's just mind-boggling, Randy, to think that, if the voters in San Francisco knew that his background, knew what his true intentions were when he got in office, that he would have ever been elected. I've heard people say about the New York City DA when he was elected a year or two ago. And he basically came into office and said, we're not going to be prosecuting a lot of the criminals out there. We're not going to be giving them stiff sentences. The jails and prisons are overcrowded. We shouldn't have so many people there. And I heard many voters who voted for that guy say, if I had known the types of policies he was going to put in place to support criminals and be against law enforcement, I would never have voted for him in the first place. And I think that's where we are now. In San Francisco, they're doing a recall election, because that's what they do in California if they want you out of office and they're not happy with you. There's a good chance he will be recalled and he will be out of office after today. So time will tell, but I hope the voters in San Francisco have wised up. They realize crime is rampant, and they need tougher prosecutors in place to make sure these criminals who deserve to be behind bars are kept there.
I'm watching this with bated breath. I really am, because if he is recalled, this will be a major win for people who are really concerned now about the tsunami of crime surging across America. If, however, he is not recalled, I will view this as a major defeat for the cause. So we got a lot riding on this. I think it will be a major demonstration of what the future will bring, especially because there is a similar recall effort right now in Los Angeles with George Gascon. George Gascon is an anomaly to me. This guy was actually an LAPD police commander. He was of high rank, got his law degree, wound up being the district attorney in San Francisco, which I guess is maybe the fertile ground for radical liberalism. But he was there before he got elected in Los Angeles. Now, of course, the similarities in both Los Angeles and San Francisco is out of control violent crime. Not just violent crime, all crime across the board. And Gascon, I think if he's not, he may even be more radical than Chesa Boudin. But what's interesting in Gascon's case, well, in Chesa Boudin's case, more than 40% of the district attorneys that were working in the district attorney's office quit because of Boudin. But it's interesting because in Los Angeles, there is a strong assistant district attorneys union. And so they had an entirely different approach to dealing with Gascon, and that's absolute mutiny. They have issued no confidence votes. They have gone public with recrimination towards him. And now that there is a recall effort that is very close to having the number of signatures to move this on the ballot, we're now seeing Gascon trying to do the politician shuffle and kind of try and camouflage himself a little bit. But in this, there's a recent incident that came to light, and I want to talk about this for just a moment. This happened I think about a year ago. A 17-year-old wrong-way driver intentionally, by all appearances, including video, ran over a mother and her infant baby. And Gascon, in his milquetoast prosecution, somehow negotiated a plea deal to this guy. So 5 to 7 months in a juvenile probation camp. So he's not going to serve any prison time. Then his record will be expunged, and the way he charged this guy, where he should have done attempted murder, he made sure that he did the lowest levels of crime that he could. Well, when this became a news item, he's now trying to deflect. He actually completely lied to the media and said that the plea deal was negotiated with the approval of the LA Sheriff's Department. And when Sheriff Villanueva came up and said it's a lie, it never happened, suddenly he had to walk that back. So now we're seeing another recall effort of another radical district attorney, and these are two major focus points that all of American law enforcement is watching. And but let's look at this in relation to how did these guys get into office? What's the one name that pops up every single time we're talking about a radical agenda and elections? George Soros. But, George Soros. It's every time we delve down into who financed this. Where did the money come from to put forth an election and sink millions and millions of dollars into the leftist agenda and the strategy of putting radical district attorneys in place? And George Soros' name just balloons out everywhere. But let me ask you this, Craig. We now know that there's somewhere around 70 radical district attorneys been placed into office. What do you think the strategy is behind this?
Well, I think they've clearly taken advantage of an incident that got a lot of attention. That's George Floyd's death, of course. And then the media has decided to pile on top of that case all these other anecdotal cases that seem to tie into the narrative of cops as brutal racists, targeting blacks, too many blacks being arrested, too many blacks being shot by police, etc. And again, the facts don't support that narrative at all. But if you want to be anecdotal in the way you present your evidence, there are some cases that might be able to be thrown into the George Floyd mix and end up with all these soft on crime district attorneys around this country. But it's embarrassing to me to think that the electorate in these cities would elect people that had no business being in those offices, that their intent was not to protect their community. Their intent was not to promote public safety, but it was somehow to be the advocates for the criminals in our nation. And this is very unfortunate. We have to realize that crime in this country peaked in 1991. Violent crime was at its highest point. And then a lot of good law enforcement occurred in the subsequent months and years that allowed crime to go down to historically low levels. All right. Part of that was the broken windows philosophy initiated by Bill Bratton, among others, who said, let's go after low-level criminals because that's going to affect major crimes. All right. We're going to be able to lower major crimes by arresting the lower-level criminals. And it worked. And we got tougher on crime. California enacted the 3 strikes and you're outlaw. So, I mean, here we've gone one pendulum swing to the other. In California, where they were one of the toughest states in the country on criminals at one point with the 3 strikes and you're outlaw. And now they've gone to where they want to let out all the criminals from the jails and the prisons in California. So this is frightening to think that this could happen in our nation. And again, I, in many ways, blame the complicit media that simply has a narrative that they want to put forth. And they've allowed these politicians to get elected based on lies and anecdotal evidence, totally unsubstantiated by the facts and figures that will tell you how effective law enforcement had been up until George Floyd's death, and could have continued to be effective afterwards, but they weren't allowed to because of the Defund the Police movement.
Well, when I look at the historical record now of when did we start seeing the anti-law enforcement movement? Where did we see the beginning of it? And when I look back in history, I, of course, examine from a historical perspective. I keep on going back to the election of Barack Obama. Barack Obama came in as a hope for America, a hope to heal. The first black president. I was a supporter. I thought that he would be an individual, a catalyst for bringing our nation together. It turned out that was quite the opposite effect. But when the President of the United States, shortly after his election, came out publicly calling the police, saying the police acted stupidly when it came down to arresting one of his own goofy friends who literally created his own arrest because of his uncooperation during a legitimate police investigation, I got this sinking feeling, and it was borne out over his entire service as president. He divided the police from the people. He's the one who created an anti-law enforcement Department of Justice that basically victimized law enforcement around the country. He supported and of course, prior to George Floyd, we had the Michael Brown case, which is really where we saw violence tear our cities apart, all based once again on another false narrative, the greatest lie probably ever perpetuated on an anti-law enforcement platform: hands up, don't shoot. We saw this tear America apart. And then we saw the President of the United States actually support the narrative of the police, once again, targeting and acting brutally. So, this has been a long time in coming. It didn't start with George Floyd, but it certainly became, the fuel was just poured onto the fire. But so now let's look at the real world effects of what this anti-law enforcement, defund the police movement. Let's see. This is a headline that just came out, and I think it'll point out to our viewers and our listeners the real world consequences. There was a Seattle Police Department. An internal memo was leaked, and happily it was leaked, whereupon the supervisors of the Seattle Police Department basically came out. They came out and said, we're so understaffed that we're not going to even investigate adult sexual assault cases. I read it. I'm going to say I read this internal memo maybe a month and a half ago, but it didn't really catch steam until it just came out again with this headline: Seattle PD sex assault units low staffing, case backlog is unacceptable, the mayor says. Mayor Bruce Harrell denied a report that the city isn't prioritizing sexual assault cases, but admitting staffing is, quote, not where it needs to be, unquote. This is a bald-faced lie by the mayor. Now, in all fairness, this mayor was not the mayor when Seattle lost its collective mind, when the city actually, gave up a police precinct, where they gave up blocks of the city to the chop zone, God knows whatever that stood for, where the police were not even allowed to go in by these self-styled radicals. He wasn't the mayor then, but he is now, and now he's trying to make excuses when the reality is quite clear. They're not even investigating sexual assault cases. Now, you and I both know, Craig, that is a startling consequence. But isn't this what we're seeing around the country? The lowering of law enforcement capabilities due to this whole entire movement that we've been seeing.
Well, without question, the defund the police movement caused politicians to react in cities across this country in a very knee-jerk, a very irresponsible manner without thinking about the consequences of their actions. Seattle could be the poster child for the defund the police movement and the troubling consequences that have resulted. They've lost hundreds of officers since 2020. They are now at the lowest staffing levels they've seen since the 1980s. All right. And the comment from the mayor are similar to comments we've heard from other mayors around this country, including in Minneapolis, where all this started, where they chopped so much money out of their police budget in a knee-jerk fashion, $7.7 million initially. Now Minneapolis is being sued by their own citizens because of the understaffing levels. Apparently there's a charter that says they have to have a certain number of officers to protect the citizens of Minneapolis, and they're so far below that level that the citizens have no choice, but they've sued them in court. Let's think about where we are with police staffing around this country, thanks to the defund the police movement and all the anti-cop hatred. One officer recently said, we're one bullet from the grave and we're one mistake from an indictment. Why would I want to continue to be a police officer? So that officer in Atlanta retired. All right. We're seeing that across this country. We've seen a 43% increase in officer resignation since 2019, pre-George Floyd. We've seen a 24% increase in retirements. A lot of those officers leaving the job much sooner than they would have otherwise. And as a result, we have the lowest per capita police staffing in this country than we've seen in the last 25 years. So what's happening? Crime is surging. We don't have proactive policing anymore. More than 70% of officers recently surveyed said they're less likely to stop a suspicious person or vehicle because of all this anti-cop, I'm going to sue you, I'm going to throw you in jail if you make a mistake. And so as a result, proactive policing, which is the single factor that has been proven to reduce crime in this country, reduce violent crime, is no longer being employed by a vast majority of officers in this country. That's extremely alarming and troubling, and we're seeing the consequences of that. And it's not the fault of the officers, it's the fault of the politicians who aren't supporting them. It's the fault of the media who are crucifying them each and every day, anytime they get a chance. And it's the fault of the public, frankly, for staying silent and for electing these soft on crime politicians.
You've hit it all on the head. It's your base of knowledge and the fact that you know the statistics is something that's very refreshing. This is amazing information that you've been able to impart to my listeners and our viewers. We're kind of running up against the clock here, so once again, please tell the audience how they can find you, get more information about Citizens Behind the Badge.
Yeah, please go to our website. That's behindbadge.org. It's packed full of information, so much of what we've talked about here today, but so much more. I update it every day. All right, so I'm giving you the latest news about law enforcement, similar to what you're doing here, Randy, each episode. And go there and leave your name and email address there on that homepage opportunity. And we will stay in touch with you. We will keep you informed of what's going on in this country regarding law enforcement, regarding law and order, and the troubling consequences of defund the police. And we will give you action steps that can be taken to help keep your community safe and make sure the officers receive the support and resources needed to keep America safe.
Well, Craig, thanks so much for joining me here on The Voice for American Law Enforcement. We'll definitely be speaking very soon. In fact, why don't you stay in the interview room and you and I will chat afterwards. But thanks again. Craig Floyd, the founder of Citizens behind the badge. So at the end of our show, we do something called End of Watch. It's the way that we mourn the men and women of the law enforcement profession who have made the ultimate sacrifice and given their lives in the line of duty the previous week. So I've got a couple names to read. Once again, terribly sad. The first is Officer Adrian Lopez, Sr. of the White Mountain Apache Tribal Police Department. Officer Adrian Lopez was shot and killed during a traffic stop on East Fork Road in White River, Arizona at about 7:10 p.m. An altercation occurred between Officer Lopez and the driver, during which time Officer Lopez was fatally shot. The subject then stole Officer Lopez's patrol vehicle and fled the scene with other White Mountain Apache police in pursuit. The pursuit traveled almost 40 miles before officers and the subject exchanged shots near Hawley Lake, during which another officer was wounded and the subject was killed. Officer Lopez was a U.S. Army veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He had served with the White Mountain Apache Tribal Police for 5 months, previously served 10 months with the United States Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs of Justice Services in Wind River, Wyoming. He is survived by his wife and 2 children. Officer Adrian Lopez, Sr., White Mountain Apache Tribal Police, End of Watch, Thursday, June 2nd, 2022. The second is Deputy Sheriff Thomas E. Baker III, Nicholas County Sheriff's Department, West Virginia. Deputy Sheriff Tom Baker was shot and killed after he and another deputy responded to a domestic disturbance in the Birch River area of the county. He and his partner were talking to 2 men who had come out of a trailer. Both men ran back into the trailer as the deputies pursued them and attempted to apprehend them by deploying a taser. Once inside the trailer, the men opened fire on the deputies. Deputy Baker was struck in the back and his partner was wounded in the leg as they sought cover outside of the trailer. Despite their wounds, they were able to return fire and one of the men was killed. The second man was apprehended following a barricade and charged with first-degree murder. Deputy Baker has served in law enforcement for a total of 19 years. Prior to joining the Nicholas County Sheriff's Department, he served with the Cowan Police Department, Summersville Police, Raleigh County Sheriffs, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. He is survived by his wife and 2 children. Deputy Sheriff Thomas E. Baker III, Nicholas County Sheriff's Department, West Virginia, End of Watch, Friday, June 3rd, 2022. Each of these men gave their lives in the line of duty, serving their communities. May they rest in peace. Well, I want to thank you for joining me today again here at the Voice for American Law Enforcement. You can see this on AmericaOutloud.com, on YouTube. You can listen to it on iHeartRadio. And we're all over the place. I love to hear from you guys. You can find me on Facebook at The Voice for American Law Enforcement. You can contact me if you have suggestions, if you have comments, and most specifically, if you want to support law enforcement, as I'm sure you do, there is a very practical way to do that, and that is by supporting the Wounded Blue. Go to thewoundedblue.org. The Wounded Blue is the National Assistance and Support Organization for injured and disabled law enforcement officers, a nationwide charity that helps cops who have been shot, stabbed, beaten, suffering injuries, either physical or emotional and psychological. We've helped more than 10,000 officers in the last 3 years. I'm very proud of the men and women that I serve with in this organization. They are doing amazing work. They are literally saving lives. But we can't do it without you. We are a nationwide charity. Your tax-deductible donation is welcomed. Easy to give. Go to thewoundedblue.org, hit the donate button, and give whatever you can afford. $5, $10. If you can do a monthly donation, we really do appreciate that. If you want to sponsor the Wounded Blue or any of the events, we actually have the National Law Enforcement Officer Survival Summit coming up, October 11th through the 14th. If you're a police officer, this is a must-attend event. The information in the Law Enforcement Survival Summit Might save your life, might save your career, might save your marriage. Every aspect about surviving a law enforcement career will be at the National Law Enforcement Survival Summit. It's our second annual. It will be held in Terre Haute, Indiana, October 11th through the 14th. You can register for this. It's only $295 for 4 days of the best training you'll ever get. Go to thewoundedblue.org for information and to register. I'm Randy Sutton, your host. Thank you so much for joining me again today at The Voice for American Law Enforcement.